He was not the kind of man anyone arranged anything around. That was what made it strange. Thomas Carter had lived 41 years in a way that drew very little attention to itself. He woke early. He made coffee in a kitchen that was always clean. He drove to work before most people had finished their first alarm. He came home, checked on his son, ate whatever was in the refrigerator, and read until he fell asleep in the chair by the window. On weekends, he took Eli to the park near the water, and they would walk along the path that followed the shore of Lake Ontario, not always talking, which suited them both. He had not expected anyone to interfere with this. He had in fact spent several years making sure no one could. The call from his mother came on a Tuesday in late October, which was already unusual. Eleanor Carter did not call on Tuesdays. She called on Sunday afternoons between 2 and 4, always when Eli was napping or at a friend's house, as if she had calculated the exact window in which Thomas would be available, and slightly off guard. The Tuesday call meant something had shifted in her thinking, and Thomas knew before he answered that he was not going to enjoy the conversation. "I've spoken with Leonard Ashworth," she said. Thomas set down his coffee. "About what?" "About his daughter, Vivienne." A pause, deliberate. "She's 32. She's been working in Halifax, something with environmental consulting. She's coming back to Toronto in November, and Leonard and I feel it would be good for you both to meet." Thomas did not say anything for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the maple in the backyard had lost most of its leaves. A few clung to the branches with a stubbornness that struck him as familiar. "I'm not looking to meet anyone," he said. "You're not looking for a great many things," Eleanor said. "That doesn't mean they aren't necessary." He understood then that the conversation had been decided before it started. His mother had a way of presenting negotiations that had already concluded. She would lay out the facts with a kind of gentle precision, as though she were simply describing what was already true, and Thomas had learned years ago that arguing against her facts was less effective than appearing to consider them before quietly doing nothing. He had used this strategy successfully for most of his adult life, but Eleanor had been refining her own strategies over the same period. "Ellie needs consistency," she said. "He needs to see what a household looks like when it functions. You know this." "Ellie is 7, Thomas said. "He functions fine. He asked me last month why you don't have a girlfriend. I told him I didn't know." Thomas picked up his coffee again. "What did he say to that?" "He said he thought maybe you forgot how." There was a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable. Thomas looked at the maple tree and thought about his son, who was currently at school learning long division and probably thinking about the hockey game on Friday, and almost certainly not thinking about his father's romantic life with any real depth of feeling. "One dinner," Eleanor said. "That's all I'm asking." He said he would think about it, which both of them understood to mean yes. Vivienne Ashworth arrived at the restaurant 7 minutes late, which Thomas had expected. Her father was chronically early. It was a reasonable assumption that she had spent her life compensating. She came in from the cold with her coat still buttoned, and her cheeks flushed from the wind off the lake, and she spotted Thomas at the corner table with the same efficient scan that he used when entering unfamiliar rooms. He recognized it as the look of someone who was accustomed to assessing situations before committing to them. She sat down without ceremony. "My father didn't mention you had a son," she said, before she had even opened the menu. "My mother didn't mention your divorce," Thomas replied. A pause. Then something shifted in her expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Finalized 8 months ago," she said. "Yours? 4 years." He watched her. "Does that change anything for you?" Vivienne considered this with the seriousness it deserved, which Thomas appreciated. Most people either dismissed the question entirely or overcorrected toward reassurance. She did neither. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Does my divorce change anything for you?" "No," he said, "but I thought you should have the information." They ordered. The restaurant was not the kind his mother usually chose. She tended toward places with white tablecloths and a wine list organized by region, but Leonard Ashworth had apparently overridden her on this, and the result was a place with exposed brick and good halibut, and the particular hum of a room where people were having real conversations. Thomas found he didn't mind it. Over dinner, Vivienne told him about Halifax. She talked about the estuary work, the sediment sampling, the particular satisfaction of a problem that could be measured in parts per million. She talked the way people talked when they were comfortable with their own expertise, not to impress, but because the subject was genuinely interesting to her. Thomas listened, which he was good at. He asked questions that were not small talk. She answered them without deflecting. She did not ask him what he did for a living, which was unusual. Most people asked within the first 10 minutes. He wondered if she already knew and had decided not to make it the center of the conversation. At the end of the evening, standing outside on King Street while the wind pushed a paper cup along the sidewalk, she said, "I'm going to be honest with you. My father and your mother have an idea about this. I don't know if I share it. Neither do I," Thomas said. But the conversation was good. It was. She looked at him for a moment with the same measured attention she had given the menu, the halibut, the question of his divorce. "I'll be in Toronto until March," she said. "I'm not making any promises. I wouldn't know what to do with a promise," he said. "March seems reasonable." She laughed then, brief, unguarded, the first unguarded thing she'd shown him all evening, and walked to the parking garage without looking back. Thomas stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer. The wind was cold and direct. He thought about Eli, who would be asleep by now, and about the maple tree in the backyard, and about the fact that he was 41 years old, and still surprised by the specific texture of a good conversation. He walked to his car and drove home. November became December in the way Canadian Novembers do, incrementally, and then all at once, and then there was snow on the ground, and it seemed implausible that there had ever been anything else. Thomas drove Eli to school in the mornings, and Eli talked about his friends and his hockey team, and a book he was reading about a boy who discovers a meteorite in his backyard, and Thomas listened and made the appropriate responses and thought about Vivienne Ashworth with the same quiet, methodical attention he gave to problems at work. He had not told Eli about the dinner. He was not sure what he would have said. He was not sure what the dinner was. They had coffee 3 times in December. Once near her temporary apartment in the annex, once near his office downtown, once. This one had not been planned. Running into each other at the Bloor Street Market on a Saturday afternoon when Thomas was buying apples, and Vivienne was attempting to choose between 2 kinds of local cheese with the focused seriousness that she appeared to bring to most decisions. Eli was with him that day, his toque pulled down over his ears, his attention divided between his father's conversation and a display of honey in hexagonal jars. Vivienne crouched down to his level without making a production of it. "What's your name?" she asked. "Eli Carter," he said. "What's yours?" Eli considered this. "That's a lot of letters." "It is," she agreed. "Most people call me Viva." "Okay, Viv," he said, apparently satisfied, and went back to looking at the honey. Thomas watched this exchange and said nothing. Later, walking back to the car with Eli's hand in his and the bag of apples over his shoulder, Eli said, "Is she your girlfriend?" "No," Thomas said. "Do you want her to be?" Thomas thought about the careful, reasonable answer, and then he thought about his son, who was 7 years old and already had a better instinct for what mattered than most people Thomas had met at twice his age. "I'm thinking about it," Thomas said. Eli nodded as if this were a sensible position and returned to his thoughts about the honey. He told her about the company in January. It had not come up, deliberately, on his part. He had watched people change when they learned about it, had watched the quality of attention shift, the calibration of conversation adjust to account for the new information. It was not that they became dishonest. It was that they became aware of something they hadn't been aware of before, and that awareness changed the geometry of everything that followed. He had grown tired of that adjustment. He had, over time, simply stopped offering the information. With Vivienne, he had wanted to know what she thought of him when she didn't know. He recognized this as perhaps unfair. He had not been able to help it. They were at her apartment in the annex, after dinner. She had cooked salmon with some kind of grain that she called farro, which Thomas had not had before but found he liked, and she was telling him about a project proposal for the spring, a commission up near Sudbury, and she was asking whether he thought she should take it, whether the distance made sense, whether March was still where she'd thought it was when she arrived in November. He realized, listening to her talk about March, that he had been hoping she would stay past it. "There's something I should have told you earlier," he said. She put her glass down. He recognized the pause. She was doing the same thing he did, which was giving the other person room to be honest without filling the space prematurely. "Carter Industrial," he said. "The holding company. That's mine." She was quiet for a long moment. Carter Industrial was not a name that required explanation in Ontario. It had been in the financial pages often enough, and in the business sections of the papers, and once, a profile that Thomas had agreed to and immediately regretted in a magazine supplement about Canadian entrepreneurs under 50. His grandfather had built the original manufacturing operation in Hamilton. His father had expanded it. Thomas had restructured it twice. taken it in a different direction than either of them would have chosen, and ended up with something considerably larger than any of them had planned. He did not find it interesting as a topic. It was the thing he did, not the thing he was. Vivienne looked at him. "How long did you know you weren't going to tell me?" "From the second dinner," he said. "I'm sorry for that. You were testing me. I was protecting myself," he said. "I'm not sure there's a meaningful difference." She picked up her glass again. He waited. "I knew who you were," she said finally. "I looked you up after the first dinner. Your father's name was on a building near my university. I recognized the name." Thomas absorbed this. "And you didn't say anything. Neither did you." They sat with that for a moment, two people who had been careful with each other for the same reason from opposite directions, and who had arrived, somehow, at the same place anyway. "The proposal near Sudbury," Thomas said. "What's the timeline?" "April through July, if I take it." "April through July is workable," he said. "If you want it to be." Vivienne looked at him. "You're not a very romantic person," she said. "No," he agreed. "Neither am I," she said, and smiled. His mother found out about Vivienne in February, through Leonard Ashworth, who had heard it from Vivienne herself. Eleanor Carter was not a woman who made a great deal of noise about things, but she appeared at Thomas's house on a Saturday morning with a coffee from the good place on Queen Street and a look of careful, contained satisfaction that Thomas found mildly exhausting. "I'm not going to make a thing of it," she said, sitting at his kitchen table. "I know," Thomas said, which was not the same as believing her. Eli came downstairs in his hockey gear. He had practice at 9 and stopped when he saw his grandmother. "Grandma Eleanor, I'm going to be late," he said with the patient urgency of someone who had had this conversation before. "I know," Eleanor said. "Your father is going to drive you in 4 minutes." Eli looked at Thomas. "Is 4 minutes accurate?" "Get your bag," Thomas said. Eleanor watched Eli thunder back up the stairs and then turned back to Thomas with the expression she used when she wanted him to understand that she was being restrained. "I like Vivienne," she said. "I know. Leonard says she's serious about her work. He says she doesn't make decisions lightly. She doesn't. Has she met Eli?" "Once. At the market." And Thomas got up to find Eli's water bottle, which was always either on the counter or under the bench in the front hall and never anywhere else. She crouched down and talked to him like a person, he said. He called her by her first name and went back to looking at honey jars. Eleanor smiled. It was not the controlled, considered smile she used in most situations. It was something smaller and realer. "That's good," she said. It was, Thomas agreed, and found the water bottle under the bench. The arrangement, that word kept appearing in his mind, though he had never used it out loud, had been his mother's idea in its origin, but had become something else entirely in the execution. Thomas was honest enough with himself to recognize the difference. What Eleanor had arranged was a dinner with a suitable woman. What had happened after that dinner was not his mother's doing, and not Leonard Ashworth's doing, and not the result of any plan. What had happened was Vivienne, sitting across a table in a restaurant with exposed brick, telling him about parts per million with the calm precision of someone who found the world genuinely measurable. What had happened was the market in December, and Eli saying her name back to her without ceremony. What had happened was a January evening in the annex with faro and salmon, and a silence that had held something honest. He drove Eli to hockey practice and listened to Eli describe a new play their coach had diagrammed, something involving a lateral pass that Eli was fairly certain he had almost figured out. The rink was 20 minutes from the house and the roads were clear, and the sky above the city was the particular white of a February morning that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to snow. "Dad," Eli said from the back seat. "Yeah, is Viv going to come to my game sometime?" Thomas looked at the road. "Do you want her to?" Ellie thought about this with the deliberateness he had inherited from somewhere that Thomas recognized without quite acknowledging. "She'd probably want to know the rules first," he said. "She seems like someone who'd want to know the rules." Thomas said nothing. He thought Eli was probably right. "I could explain them to her," Eli added. "I'm good at explaining hockey." "You are," Thomas said. They drove the rest of the way without talking. The radio played something instrumental and the highway opened up past the exit for the gardener, and Eli pressed his forehead against the cold window and watched the city. She stayed past March. The Sudbury project fell through in late February, a funding issue on the client's side, nothing Vivienne had done, and she was recalibrating her next several months when Thomas made a suggestion that was practical in its framing and rather less practical in its implication. There was work in Hamilton, he said. The company had a remediation project near the old industrial site, water table issues, Contamination from decades of manufacturing, the kind of problem that required exactly the kind of expertise she had. He could arrange an introduction to the project lead if she wanted to look at the scope. She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a coincidence," she said. "No," he said. "It's a project that exists. The introduction would be real. The decision would be yours. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you information," he said. "What you do with it is up to you." Vivienne looked out the window of his kitchen. It was a Sunday in early March and there was still snow in the backyard, but the quality of the light had changed in the way it did at that time of year, still cold, but angled differently, suggesting something further away. Eli was upstairs. From somewhere above them came the particular thumping of a 7-year-old engaged in an activity that did not require parental supervision, but that would probably result in something needing to be explained later. The company's name would be on the contract, she said. Yes, people would know, yes. She turned back. "I'm not interested in being managed, Thomas. If I take the project, I take it on my terms. My findings, my methodology, my report." "I know," he said. "That's why I thought of you." Another silence. Above them, the thumping had been replaced by a sound that might have been building blocks or might have been something more precarious. "Send me the scope document," she said. He did, that afternoon. She sent back 14 questions by 9 that evening. He forwarded them to the project lead with a note that said only, "She's thorough, answer all of them." Eli's hockey team won their division in late March, which Eli had been working toward with a focused intention that Thomas recognized as genetic and found quietly gratifying. The final game was on a Saturday morning, and Vivienne came. She had, as Eli had predicted, asked for a full explanation of the rules beforehand, and had arrived with her own notes on defensive zone coverage that she had made from watching clips online, which Eli found both unnecessary and extremely impressive. After the game, standing in the rink lobby while Eli's team sorted through the chaos of hockey bags and celebratory shouts from parents, Vivienne stood beside Thomas and watched the room with the same quiet attention she brought to everything. "He's good," she said. "He works at it," Thomas said. "He's not naturally the best skater on the team. He decided when he was 5 that that wasn't going to matter." Vivienne watched Eli, who was currently being lifted briefly off the ground by a teammate considerably larger than him. He got that from somewhere. Thomas said nothing. He thought about his father, who had built things out of stubbornness more than inspiration, and about himself at 7, standing in a different rink in a different city, deciding in the wordless way that children decided things that he was going to be competent at whatever he tried, or he was going to understand precisely why he wasn't. "I signed the Hamilton contract," Vivienne said. Thomas looked at her. "I called the project lead yesterday," she said. "We agreed on terms. I start in 2 weeks. "Good," he said. "It's a 4-month engagement," she said, "which takes me to July." She paused. "Which is further than March." Thomas looked back at the lobby, at Eli, who had extracted himself from the larger teammate and was now making his way through the crowd toward them, still in his gear, his hair damp and his face flushed and carrying something of the uncomplicated happiness that Thomas associated with his son at his most specifically himself. "Further than March is fine," Thomas said. Eli arrived and looked up at Vivienne with the directness he used when he was about to say something that adults would consider more perceptive than a 7-year-old should be. "Did you understand the offside rule?" he asked. "I understood it by the 3rd period," Vivienne said. "I missed it in the 2nd. It's confusing in the 2nd, Eli said magnanimously. "I can draw you a diagram if you want." "I'd like that," she said seriously. Eli nodded as though a contract had been settled and went to get his bag. Thomas stood in the lobby of the rink, with the noise of the crowd moving around them and the cold smell of ice underneath everything, and he thought about his kitchen on a Tuesday in October when his mother had called, and the 7 minutes Vivienne had been late to the restaurant, and Eli choosing between jars of honey with the gravity of someone making a real decision. He thought about how little of this had been arranged and how much of it had simply happened, quietly, in the way that things that last tend to happen. Not all at once, but incrementally, each thing following from the one before it with the logic of something that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized. Outside, through the glass doors of the rink, the March light was strong and particular and cold, and it fell across the parking lot without ceremony, the way light did in that season, indifferent to what had been decided, indifferent to what was coming, simply present, as it had always been.